I was 2 hours deep into the best nap I had in months, buried under 3 blankets while a soft snowstorm rattled the window panes when suddenly the front door shook so violently that I thought someone had taken a battering ram to it. I jolted upright, half convinced a bear had figured out how to knock. I stumbled over to the window and peered through the frosted glass. Standing there in the swirling snow like a suburban gargoyle was a figure in a neon parka, clipboard tucked under her arm like she was about to cite the wind for blowing the wrong way. It was Linda Cratton, queen of the HOA, destroyer of weekends and apparently now the self-appointed warden of my mountain cabin. She was pounding her gloved fist on my door as if the trees, the snow, and even silence itself owed her an explanation for existing. I cracked the door open just wide enough for her voice to slice its way inside. She did not even waste time with hello. Instead she dove right in with that sugar-sour tone she deployed whenever she wanted something for free. "You need to unlock the guest wing immediately," she snapped, each word coming out in small, frosty puffs of entitlement. I stared at her, still half asleep, almost laughing despite the sting of the cold air. Apparently, she had decided on her own that my private cabin was the perfect overflow motel for her cousin's wedding guests. "The guest wing is locked for a reason," I told her, but she shoved a sheet of paper at me anyway, waving it like it carried some kind of authority. A jumble of legal-sounding nonsense about community goodwill and contributing to neighborhood harmony was printed across it, though in truth it read like a badly disguised order for me to give her what she wanted without question. I reminded her in clear language that this was my property, bought outright with money earned working long hours away from entitled people like her. But Linda, as ever, had a bag of tactics waiting. She switched gears so fast I almost admired her audacity. First came the threats of fines under mysterious rules. Then the guilt trips about how I was ruining a once-in-a-lifetime family memory. When that failed, she whipped out her phone to record me, holding it up like she had caught Bigfoot hoarding spare bedrooms from innocent townsfolk. But instead of shrinking, I told her to feel free to post whatever she wanted. Maybe someone would finally see how ridiculous she was. My response only deepened the scowl behind her staged politeness. She spat words like selfish, unneighborly, and a disgrace to the mountain community, then stormed away down my steps without even giving me a chance to answer. Her boots slammed angrily against the fresh snow, stamping each word of her rage into the ground like blunt punctuation marks. When the door closed, I leaned my forehead against the wood, heart still drumming from the confrontation. Peace and silence were the reasons I had come here. My cabin had always been my clear line in the sand between a quiet life of my own making and the endless noise of people who believed they were entitled to a share of it. This attack on that line was small but felt like the opening act of a larger show, and I knew enough about Linda Cratton to sense that she was far from finished. I sat back on the couch and told myself she would vent for a day and then vanish. I told myself she would find a motel in town like any sensible person would. But as I turned to the security monitor I had rigged to a pine tree out front, I felt the chill crawl deeper. On the glowing screen, she was still there at the edge of the driveway, phone pressed against her face, whispering as furiously as if she were calling in an airstrike. I turned up the volume just enough to hear fragments. Enough to know this situation was only beginning. She was already plotting how to make me regret crossing her, talking about calling the board, talking about how this cabin should practically be considered community property since I was rarely here to enjoy it myself. I sat down heavily. The nap was gone. Awake and alert, I could already imagine the catalogue of petty maneuvers Linda was capable of unleashing. She was not the type to let a locked door, nor a clear no, stop her from getting what she wanted. And if she thought threats, fines, and spin could pry open my guest wing, she was about to discover just how stubborn I could be when it came to my solitude. I poured the last of my coffee into the old thermos and peered once more through the icy window. She was gone now, the snow swallowing her footprints faster than she could make them. But that only deepened the feeling rising inside me. This was not over. Not by a long shot. I woke the next morning to the kind of silence that only makes sense when you know it is about to be broken. Overnight the storm had buried the pines so thickly their branches bent beneath the weight. My truck sat beneath a fresh, heavy coat of snow that I guessed would take at least an hour to shovel off. Muscles still sore from yesterday's sudden adrenaline, I stretched and half convinced myself that maybe Linda had cooled down and slithered back to whatever nest of misery she called home. I brewed a pot of coffee and stood at the window, sipping as a pair of deer picked their cautious way across the yard. For an instant, surrounded by the untouched white and that perfect quiet, it almost felt as though I had imagined the entire confrontation. But then my eyes caught a flash of fluorescent color against the wood of my front door. I set down the mug and yanked open the door. Bright orange tape flapped madly in the wind, holding a thick piece of paper to the frame. The cold slapped my face awake harder than the strongest coffee. The letter was printed cleanly across HOA letterhead, the kind stamped with a seal they clearly believed carried the authority of the government. At the top, in unforgiving block letters, it read, "Violation of Article 7 subsection B, failure to participate in community goodwill and neighborly outreach." Beneath that ridiculous phrase was a $50 fine. Practically pocket change. But at the bottom came the promise of escalating penalties and potential review of my property privileges if I did not comply. I snorted so hard I nearly choked, crumpling the paper in my glove. Community goodwill, according to Linda, apparently translated to me turning my private cabin into a free YMCA. I stuffed the notice into my pocket, not for payment, but for evidence. She wanted a war of paper and fines. Fine. I would play, but on my terms. By the time I trudged down the hill to the community lodge, the so-called brunch was already in full swing. I could hear the chatter of polite voices before I even pushed open the doors. Inside, the smell of cheap coffee mixed with store-bought muffins. Folding chairs were scattered around, filled with strangers balancing paper plates in their laps. And there, at the center of it all, the queen bee herself held court. Linda glided from table to table, clipboard tucked under her arm like a scepter, her practiced smile stretched so wide it made her teeth look sharp. Her cousin's wedding guests sat scattered among the tables, some bored, some confused, all of them turning their heads to watch as I entered. Linda's eyes caught mine. Narrowing first with irritation, then snapping back into sugary composure, she pasted on her grin and marched toward me like she was greeting her oldest friend in the world. "There you are," she sang loudly, just enough for the room to hear. "I was telling everyone what a generous host you've been." The sarcasm in her syrupy tone was nearly visible. "Generous," I repeated loudly. "That is news to me. You mean the part where you tried to force me into giving up my private cabin for free?" The room shifted immediately as some of the guests looked uneasy and shuffled in their chairs. One man near the window spoke up and said, "I thought you told us the cabin was already booked for us, Linda." Her smile cracked, but she fought to keep it steady, then forced a glare at him sharp enough to sour milk before saying, "It is booked, he is just being difficult." I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolling to the messages between us and held the screen above my head so everyone could see. The entire record amounted to a single text from her that read, "I assume you will be reasonable about this." I declared, "This is the only agreement we have." Murmurs moved through the tables as suspicion spread across faces. A woman in the back lifted her brows and leaned to whisper to her husband. Linda flushed red and lunged toward me to grab the phone, but I pulled it back quickly. "He is lying," she snapped, her voice cracking with strain. "He promised me the wing months ago." Raising my voice so the entire hall could hear, I said, "If any of you paid money for lodging, then you were deceived. My cabin is not a hotel. If she promised you free rooms, that is her mistake." A nervous laugh rose from one side of the room and a large man in a cheap suit stood to approach me. Speaking in a low tone, he said, "My wife's parents came here from Ohio. They need a place to stay. I will pay you cash, full price, no trouble." His eyes looked honest, his shoulders burdened, a man worn from responsibility. I almost wanted to accept so that I would not appear heartless, but the truth pressed down like the storm outside. Once the door opened for one, it would never close again. "Sorry," I told him. "That is not possible. The wing is locked for repairs and more importantly it is my line in the sand." He nodded, disappointment clear but not resentment. Behind him Linda fumbled frantically to salvage her story, muttering and spinning until her voice cracked again. She stormed toward me and leaned in close, her tone a hiss through clenched teeth. "Fine, enjoy digging yourself out because no one is going to plow your drive this winter." I nearly laughed at her words because I knew which contractors bowed to her pressure and which refused, but the speed with which she stacked her threats unsettled me. I pushed past her and left before my anger turned into words that could drag me into a sheriff's warning. Her voice rose again behind me, louder, desperate to soothe the guests now buzzing with questions. My boots dug into the trail as I climbed back toward my truck, each step crunching against hard snow while my mind ran ahead of me. Linda's desperation was dangerous. I knew she would not stop here. If she could not enter willingly, she would try to slip in another way. When I shut the cabin door behind me, the silence greeted me but felt hollow. It was not rest but the tense weight that signals another storm is building. Staring out through frost-blurred glass at a forest buried in snow, I understood plainly that this place could no longer be simply refuge. It had just become my fortress, and I vowed that Linda Cratton would break herself on its walls before I ever surrendered my quiet. The silence of the cabin lasted only a night before the morning brought another test. The storm outside had eased, but tension pressed heavier than the snow that curled over the pine branches. I poured coffee and stared at the security monitor, the faint blinking light promising that at least the cameras had survived the cold. Then my phone buzzed itself off the table. The number flashing was unknown, and for a moment I nearly ignored it, but something about the timing pushed me to answer. On the other end came Linda's syrupy tone, dripping with false sweetness that made my skin crawl. She suggested we talk, suggested that we had both let things go too far, suggested that maybe we sit down and make a private neighborly agreement before the situation got uglier. I knew her too well to believe peace was her goal. She did not want resolution, she wanted leverage. I told her I would think about it and hung up before she could inject any more poison into the call. When Alex woke a short while later, hair wild and eyes bleary, I told him what she had said. He chuckled darkly and shook his head but agreed to stay. A witness would be useful when the Queen of the HOA drove back up here, which she surely would. By the time the afternoon sun struggled through the clouds, her car appeared crawling up my long snowy driveway. She climbed out dressed as though for church, smile painted wide, palms lifted in the air like a performance. She greeted me as though all the ugliness of the past days had been erased, babbling about misunderstandings, community spirit, and how she wanted to make sure things ended gracefully before gossip or courtrooms ruined everything for everyone. I let her unwind her practice speech, every phrase a ribbon wrapped around a hidden trap. When she paused, I asked her plainly what exactly she was offering. Her face brightened immediately. She promised to drop the violation notices, promised to quiet the HOA fines, promised to abandon the threats of harassment claims. In return, she wanted me to quietly agree to let a handful of her guests use the cabin wing for a week or two each season. She spoke as if she was doing me a favor. I took one step forward into the snow and said no. I told her clearly that there would be no further guests, no more lies, and no more manipulations where my property was treated as a reward for her followers. I explained that evidence was already in the hands of the sheriff, every flimsy notice and every trespass recorded. My words cracked her mask for just a heartbeat before she forced her smile back into place. She pivoted with desperation, offering to settle privately for cash, to pay damages, to close the matter quietly. But I told her I did not want her money. I wanted her gone. Her eyes narrowed, revealing the fury beneath her etiquette. "Do you really think you can stand alone up here?" she demanded. "Do you think the board will back you over me?" I stood my ground and told her I wasn't alone. Earlier that very morning I had signed papers transferring the entire guest wing and the land behind it to a conservation trust. Protected land now, untouchable, not mine and certainly not hers. No development, no rentals, no weddings, no strings. She blinked rapidly as if her mind had jammed. She tried to mumble something about contracts and rights, but Alex cut her off with calm words about her lack of jurisdiction. The silence stretched heavy. She tried a final jab, promising that I would regret cutting ties when winter storms blocked access to the roads and when I begged for community goodwill. I told her I regretted only letting her set foot on my porch the first time. I thanked her, with deliberate politeness, for reminding me that peace was never a gift from others but something we protect ourselves with stubborn resolve and unbending lines. She had no answer for that. Spinning on her polished heel, she stomped toward her car, slipping in the ice as the snow crunched angrily beneath her boots. She revved the engine like a child in a tantrum, tires spitting slush all the way down the drive. When her car disappeared among the pines, Alex and I went inside. We poured mugs of coffee strong enough to scrape rust from a pan and sat at the table in our boots watching steam curl upward. Outside the cabin the storm gathered again, but it could not breach the walls. Everything inside remained mine, steady and secure. For the first moment in many days, my space felt whole again, though I knew this battle had marked the land as much as the snow did. The next morning I woke to a sky of pale silver and a silence so deep it pressed against the windows. For the first time it was not the silence of dread but the quiet of relief. Alex sat wrapped in a blanket with his coffee steaming between his hands while I stepped out onto the porch and studied the snow that had buried every trace of Linda's last steps. He asked if I would miss the guest wing now that it belonged to the Conservation Trust. I told him I would rather share it with deer, snow, and wind than ever again see Linda's clipboard on my steps. He raised his mug to that and I clinked mine against his. The shutters rattled in the mountain wind, but the cabin held firm. No notices, no circus of guests, no fake goodwill violations nailed to my door. My home felt mine again. All through the day I turned the events over in my mind. I had fought off her petty lies, her fabricated rules, her threats, and her break-in. I had played her game and beaten her at it by refusing to use her rules. She may still gossip, still rant at the board, still try to twist the truth to any neighbor who would listen, but she had lost the one thing she craved most, which was power over me. The guest wing was out of her reach forever, the sheriff had evidence in hand, the neighbors had seen her unmasked, and for once her manipulations could not spin her back into control. Alex sat beside me on the porch steps in the crisp mountain air. We watched the world fade behind shadows as the sun dropped behind snowy ridges. He asked me if, after all of this, I finally felt peace. I told him peace is not something gifted politely. It is a boundary you draw and defend with both hands, even if it means setting glitter bombs, shoveling harder, or standing alone in the cold. Solitude costs effort, but the reward is freedom. As night fell and the sky darkened into a deep quiet blue, I closed the last lock on the cabin door and looked around at the walls, the floors, and the view that I had worked for. It was mine again, undivided, untouched, and unclaimed by anyone but me. For the first time since that nap was torn from me by the pounding of her fist, I felt exactly why I had bought this cabin in the first place. I was alone but not lonely. I was tired but not defeated. There would be more snow, more storms, and maybe more trouble, but nothing would again shake these walls the way she had tried. This mountain was my fortress and my sanctuary, and at last it was silent.